Welcome to LexTalks, Legal Topics Simplified. It's your guide to navigating the world of law.
Absolutely.
Today, we are um, diving deep into one of the cornerstones of the Indian Constitution,
Okay,
the right against exploitation.
great.
We've got a stack of articles and legal analyses to sift through.
Right.
But don't worry, we'll
Yes.
break it all down for you, highlighting what's most important for your studies.
It's a fascinating area of law,
Right?
really.
Hell yeah.
What's intriguing is how the right against exploitation goes beyond just physical abuse. It
Okay.
delves into the subtler forms, even those disguised as a contract,
Right.
or situations where someone's desperation is taken advantage of.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
Yeah.
It's not just about the obvious stuff, right?
No.
It's about recognizing that everyone deserves basic dignity
Yes.
and that no one should be forced to give up their rights just to survive.
Precisely. Imagine, for instance, bonded laborers trapped in a cycle of debt, working to repay loans they never even took out,
Wow.
or children forced to work in dangerous factories instead of getting an education. This is exactly the kind of exploitation the right against exploitation aims to prevent.
Okay, so how does this right actually work in practice?
Yeah.
What parts of the Constitution are we talking about here?
Well, the foundation lies in Articles 23 and 24 of the Indian Constitution.
Okay.
Article 23 is a powerful statement. It prohibits trafficking and forced labor in all its forms.
Okay.
It doesn't matter if someone supposedly agreed to it.
Yeah.
If there was pressure or trickery involved, it's still a violation.
So Article 23 cuts through those shady tactics, huh?
Absolutely.
I guess it's recognizing that real consent can't exist under duress.
Absolutely. And then you have Article 24, which specifically steps in to protect children.
Okay.
It prohibits the employment of children under 14 in factories, mines, or any hazardous jobs. It's the law acknowledging that children are especially vulnerable and need extra protection.
Yeah, it's like saying, hey, kids deserve a childhood, not a life of labor.
Right.
And India has actually gone beyond these articles and enacted specific laws to enforce these rights.
That's right. There's the Bonded Labor System Abolition Act of 1976,
Okay.
which, as the name suggests, aims to free people from that cycle of debt bondage.
What's interesting about that act is that it's not just about punishing the people who exploit others.
Right.
It also focuses on rehabilitation,
Yeah,
helping the victims rebuild their lives after being freed.
that's a crucial point. Escaping a bad situation isn't enough. You need support to build a new life. Then there's the Immoral Traffic Prevention Act of 1956,
Right,
which tackles human trafficking, especially for sexual exploitation.
right.
Yeah.
Because exploitation takes many forms, and that one is particularly awful. And of course, we can't forget the Child Labor Prohibition and Regulation Act of 1986. This one seems to get really specific about what kind of work is off limits for kids.
It does. It prohibits certain types of work for children and even regulates the conditions for those jobs that are allowed. For example, even if a teenager can legally work, there are rules about working hours, breaks, and safety.
So it's like the law is trying to protect kids even within the system, making sure they aren't overworked or put in danger. And then there's the Right to Education Act of 2009, which guarantees free and compulsory education for all children aged 6 to 14.
Yes,
Wow.
that's a landmark act.
Yeah.
By providing children with an education, it aims to prevent child labor at its root. It's like saying you have a right to go to school, to learn, to develop your potential, instead of being forced into work.
Taken together, all these laws show a real commitment to turning the ideals of the right against exploitation into a reality.
Yeah,
It's like India saying we're serious about protecting people, but I'm guessing it's not always that simple.
you're right. Even with strong laws, enforcement remains a challenge. Poverty, lack of awareness, and even corruption can hinder progress.
So even with all these laws in place, there are still situations where exploitation slips through the cracks.
Sadly, yes. But one fascinating development is the role of civil society. NGOs like Bakpen, Bakau, and Dalan have been instrumental in rescuing child laborers and bringing these cases to the courts. They act like watchdogs, holding those in power accountable.
That's a good point.
Yeah,
It shows that protecting these rights isn't just the government's responsibility, it's a collective effort, and we all have a role to play.
absolutely. And speaking of accountability, there have been some really interesting Supreme Court decisions that have shaped our understanding of the right against exploitation.
Okay.
One that comes to mind is the People's Union for Democratic Rights versus Union of India case from 1982.
Didn't that case deal with the question of whether being paid meant you couldn't be a victim of forced labor?
It did, and the court made it clear, even if you're getting paid, it doesn't automatically mean it's not forced labor. They really dug into the idea of economic coercion, highlighting that someone desperate for work might accept any wage, no matter how low.
So in a way, they're saying that if you have no real choice, if you're forced to accept terrible conditions just to survive, that's still exploitation.
Exactly. That case was a game changer because it forced people to look beyond the surface and acknowledge the power dynamics at play.
It's like saying that true consent can't exist when someone is backed into a corner. And this principle wasn't just applied to the government, right? It applies to private companies, too.
Yes, it does. The court recognized that economic coercion can be just as powerful as physical force, and no one gets a free pass when it comes to upholding these rights.
Right, right.
Another landmark case, Dina versus Union of India in 1983, addressed prisoner labor. The court ruled that forcing prisoners to work without pay is also a form of exploitation.
So even though someone is in prison, they don't lose their basic human rights. That's a powerful statement. But what about situations where the government does require some kind of service? Like, isn't there an exception for things like national defense?
You're right, Article 23 does allow for compulsory service for public purposes. But the key here is that it has to be for a very specific set of reasons. Things like national defense, emergencies, or disaster relief. And even then, it can't be discriminatory.
Right.
Everyone has to be treated equally, regardless of their background.
Okay, that makes sense. It's not about giving the government a blank check, but about recognizing that in extreme situations, everyone might be called upon to contribute. But even then, it has to be done fairly.
Exactly. And that's where the courts come in. They play a crucial role in making sure that the government doesn't overstep its bounds and that these exceptions are applied narrowly.
So it's a delicate balance, right, between protecting individual rights and ensuring the well-being of the whole community.
Mm,
But let's not forget that exploitation can take many forms, not just forced labor.
right.
We've talked a little about child labor, but what about human trafficking?
Human trafficking is a particularly insidious problem, often involving deception, coercion, and violence. And it's not just happening within India, it's a global issue. People are trafficked both from and within India for various reasons. Poverty, lack of opportunities, social inequalities, and even weak law enforcement.
That's a grim picture. What is being done to try and combat this?
Well, besides the Immoral Traffic Prevention Act, India has signed on to various international conventions against human trafficking. This means they're aligning their legal framework with global standards.
So they're not just going it alone, they're working with the international community to tackle this problem.
That's right. On a practical level, there are efforts to raise awareness, improve training for law enforcement, and provide support to victims of trafficking.
Sounds like a multi-pronged approach.
It has to be because human trafficking is deeply rooted. But what's encouraging is that more and more people are recognizing this as a serious issue and are committed to addressing it.
It feels like this is a theme we keep coming back to. The importance of awareness is not just about having laws. It's about people understanding their rights and being able to speak up when those rights are violated.
Absolutely. And speaking of rights in the workplace, let's shift our focus to that area. We've talked about forced labor, but what about the situations where someone technically has a job and is getting paid, but the wages are so low they're barely surviving?
That's a good point. Just because you're getting paid doesn't mean you're not being exploited. Right?
Exactly. And that's where the concept of minimum wage comes in.
Okay.
India has the Minimum Wages Act of 1948, which sets the lowest amount an employer can legally pay a worker.
It's like a safety net to prevent employers from taking advantage of desperate workers.
Right.
But of course, there's always the question of enforcement, right?
Yeah, right. So setting a minimum wage is just the first step. It needs to be enforced, and it has to be set at a level that actually allows people to live decently.
So even with minimum wage laws, there's still room for exploitation if the wage is too low or if employers don't follow the rules. What's being done to address that?
Well, labor rights organizations and unions play a vital role here. They advocate for fair wages and working conditions, making sure workers aren't being taken advantage of.
It's like they act as a counterbalance to the power of employers, making sure the playing field is at least a little bit level.
Exactly. And this is an ongoing struggle. As the cost of living goes up, the minimum wage needs to keep up too. Otherwise, it becomes meaningless. And it's not just about wages either.
Right. There are other factors that come into play when we're talking about fair working conditions, like safety measures, reasonable working hours, and even things like health benefits.
That's a good point. All those things contribute to whether someone is being exploited or not. It's about taking a holistic view of what constitutes fair labor practices.
And that brings us back to the fundamental idea behind the right against exploitation. It's about recognizing that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity, regardless of their job or social status. It's about recognizing the inherent value of every person's labor.
Well said. And I think that's a good point for us to pause. We've covered a lot of ground, from the Constitution to the courts, from bonded labor to minimum wage. It's clear that the right against exploitation is more than just words on paper. It's an intricate system of laws, institutions, and individuals working to protect people from being taken advantage of.
And it's an ongoing process. It's about constantly striving to make things better, to ensure that everyone has the opportunity to live and work with dignity and respect.
Exactly. It's a fight worth fighting. Welcome back. We've been exploring the right against exploitation in India, and I think it's time we delve deeper into one of the most challenging aspects, the bonded labor system.
Yeah, we touched on it briefly in the last part, but it's such a complex and honestly a heartbreaking issue that it deserves a closer look, especially since it's been ingrained in Indian society for so long.
Absolutely. It's a system where individuals are forced to work to pay off a debt,
Mhm.
often inherited from previous generations. And the conditions are usually appalling. We're talking about little to no pay, grueling hours, and often violence and threats to keep people trapped.
It's difficult to even imagine being caught in that kind of cycle. It's like modern day slavery.
Mm.
But I thought India outlawed this practice back in 1976 with the Bonded Labor System Abolition Act.
Yes, that's right. But as we've seen with other laws, just because something is illegal doesn't mean it disappears overnight.
Right.
Bonded labor often thrives in remote areas, in industries with informal work arrangements, and where poverty and lack of education make people easy targets.
It's like a hidden problem, making it that much harder to address. I imagine it takes a lot of effort to even uncover these cases, let alone rescue people and bring those responsible to justice.
It does, but thankfully, there are dedicated organizations working tirelessly to do just that. They face considerable risks, often facing threats and even violence, but but they're incredibly courageous, and they are making a real difference in people's lives.
So how do they actually go about freeing people from this system?
Yeah.
It seems like it would require a multifaceted approach.
It does. It usually involves a combination of legal action, community mobilization, and rehabilitation programs. They start by identifying the cases, which often requires working closely with local communities and building trust.
Okay.
It's about showing people that there's a way out, that they're not alone.
Gaining people's confidence must be crucial, especially when they've been living under such oppressive conditions.
Yeah.
And then once they've identified a case, what happens next?
Then comes the task of gathering evidence and working with law enforcement to conduct raids and rescue operations.
It sounds intense, like something you'd see in a movie.
It can be quite dramatic, yes. But it's important to remember that the rescue is just the first step. These individuals often need medical attention, psychological support, and help rebuilding their lives. That's where the rehabilitation programs come in.
Right, because escaping a terrible situation is one thing, but actually starting a new life is a whole other challenge. What do these rehabilitation programs offer?
They provide a safe haven, counseling, vocational training, and legal aid. It's about giving people the tools they need to become self-sufficient and break free from that cycle of exploitation.
It's about empowering them to build a new future for themselves. And I imagine that can be a long and difficult journey.
It can be. Many people who have been subjected to bonded labor have experienced trauma and abuse. They may have lost their sense of agency and their ability to trust. But to see someone who has been freed from that system rebuild their life, it's incredibly rewarding.
It's a testament to the strength of the human spirit. So while the problem of bonded labor is a tough one to crack, there are people fighting back and they are achieving real results.
They are. And it's vital that we support their efforts, whether through donations, volunteering, or simply raising awareness. We can all play a role in ending this form of exploitation.
It reminds me of something we discussed earlier, those landmark Supreme Court cases that have shaped our understanding of the right against exploitation. Didn't one of those cases specifically address the issue of forced labor, even when someone is technically being paid?
Yes, the People's Union for Democratic Rights versus Union of India case from 1982 was groundbreaking. The court recognized that exploitation can exist even within a seemingly legal framework. It forced people to look beyond the surface and acknowledge the power dynamics at play.
It's a good reminder that sometimes things aren't always as they seem, and that even if someone appears to have agreed to certain conditions, it doesn't necessarily mean they had a real choice.
Exactly. The court recognized that economic coercion can be just as powerful as physical force. If someone is desperate enough, they might agree to almost anything just to survive.
That's a sobering thought. It makes you realize that true freedom isn't just about the absence of physical constraints. It's also about having real options and the ability to make choices without being under duress.
That's a powerful way to put it. And this principle, established in the People's Union for Democratic Rights case, has been applied to various situations, including bonded labor. Even though the Bonded Labor System Abolition Act specifically outlaws this practice, this case provides additional legal backing. It reinforces the idea that any form of forced labor, regardless of what it's called, is a violation of fundamental rights.
And it's not just theoretical. This case has been cited in numerous other legal battles to protect workers from exploitation. It's become a cornerstone of labor law in India.
That's right. And it demonstrates how one court decision can have a ripple effect, shaping the legal landscape and influencing future judgments.
There was another case we mentioned earlier, Bandhwa Mukti Morcha versus Union of India from 1984, which also focused on bonded labor. What was significant about that one?
That case was crucial because the Supreme Court issued a series of directives aimed at identifying, releasing, and rehabilitating bonded laborers. It was a major step forward in the fight to eradicate this practice.
It shows how the courts can play an active role in social justice issues, pushing for the implementation of the law and holding those in power accountable. They didn't just say bonded labor is bad. They laid out a plan of action.
Exactly. They directed the government to set up vigilance committees, conduct surveys to identify bonded laborers, and provide rehabilitation and support services. It was a proactive approach, a clear message that they were serious about tackling this issue.
It's encouraging to see that kind of commitment from the judiciary. But as we discussed before, having laws and court rulings is one thing, but enforcement is another.
Absolutely. And that brings us back to those systemic issues we talked about: poverty, lack of awareness, and sometimes corruption. These factors can create an environment where exploitation can thrive, even when it's against the law.
It's a reminder that the legal framework is just one part of the solution. We need to address the underlying social and economic conditions that make people vulnerable to exploitation in the first place.
I completely agree. And this is where organizations like Bakpan Bakau Andalon come in. They're working on the ground, identifying cases, rescuing people, and advocating for their rights. They're the ones making sure that the law isn't just an abstract concept, but a reality for those who need it most.
It's like they're bridging the gap between the legal system and the lived reality of those who are suffering. Their work is so important.
It is. They're truly making a difference.
Okay, we've spent a good amount of time talking about bonded labor, but I think it's important to acknowledge that exploitation can wear many different masks. It's not always as blatant as forced labor. There are more subtle ways people's rights can be violated, even when it seems like everything is above board.
You're right. Bonded labor might be one of the most extreme examples, but it's not the only way the right against exploitation is relevant.
We've talked about child labor and human trafficking, but what about those situations that happen within the workplace, where someone is technically employed and being paid, but they're still being taken advantage of?
That's a really important point. Exploitation isn't always about physical force or obvious coercion. It can be about taking advantage of someone's vulnerability, their lack of options, or their desperation.
So even if someone has a job and is getting a paycheck, they could still be a victim of exploitation if the wages are unfair, the working conditions are unsafe, or if they're being treated poorly by their employer.
Exactly. And this is where India's labor laws and worker protections come into play.
We've got the Minimum Wages Act, the Factories Act, the Contract Labor Act, and a whole range of other laws designed to protect workers and ensure that they're treated fairly.
And those laws cover a wide range of issues, from minimum wage and working hours to safety regulations and health benefits. It's a whole system designed to create a more level playing field between employers and employees.
It's like setting boundaries, saying, this is the minimum standard of treatment that every worker deserves. But as we've seen with bonded labor, having laws on the books is just the first step.
Yes, enforcement is key. And that's where things can get tricky. Some employers will try to find loopholes, cut corners, or simply disregard the rules altogether.
So how do we ensure that these laws are actually being followed and that workers are being protected?
That's where labor unions and worker advocacy groups play a crucial role. They monitor working conditions, educate workers about their rights, and advocate for better protections. They act as a check on the power of employers.
It's like having a system of checks and balances, ensuring that everyone is playing by the rules and that no one is being exploited.
But it's not just about having external forces monitoring the situation, is it?
No, it's not. Workers themselves need to be empowered to speak up for their rights. They need to know what those rights are and feel confident in asserting them. It's about fostering a culture where workers feel safe and supported in raising concerns and demanding fair treatment. And it goes beyond individual workers too, right?
Absolutely. It's about creating a societal shift where labor rights are valued and respected, where exploitation is seen as unacceptable, regardless of who the victim is or what kind of work they do.
It's about recognizing that every person who contributes to society through their labor deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. And that brings us back to the very heart of the right against exploitation.
Yes, it does. It's about recognizing the inherent worth of every human being and ensuring that they are protected from being taken advantage of.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground in this part of our deep dive. We've gone from the harrowing realities of bonded labor to the more subtle forms of exploitation that can occur within the workplace. And we've seen how the right against exploitation, enshrined in the Indian Constitution, is more than just a legal concept. It's a living, breathing principle that is constantly being challenged and redefined in the face of new situations and evolving forms of exploitation.
It's an ongoing process, a constant struggle to ensure that these rights are realized for everyone. But it's a fight worth fighting.
Absolutely. And I think it's important to acknowledge that the fight for social justice, for the protection of fundamental human rights, is never truly over.
That's right. It requires constant vigilance, advocacy, and a willingness to challenge the status quo.
Okay, I think we've given our listeners a lot to think about in this part of the deep dive. What's next on our journey through the right against exploitation?
Well, in the next part, we'll shift our focus to a crucial player in this whole system, the judiciary. We'll delve into how the courts interpret and apply the right against exploitation, ensuring that it has real-world impact and serves as a safeguard against those who would seek to violate this fundamental right.
Sounds fascinating. I'm looking forward to it. Listeners, we'll be back soon to continue our exploration of the right against exploitation. In the meantime, take a moment to reflect on what we've discussed, and we'll see you in the next part.
Welcome back to our exploration of the right against exploitation in India.
It's been quite a journey so far, hasn't it? We've covered a lot of ground, from the constitutional foundations to specific laws, landmark cases, and even the challenges of enforcement.
We have, and I think now is a good time to broaden our perspective and consider the international dimension of this issue.
That's it. That's a great point. We've been focusing on India's own legal system,
Right.
but exploitation isn't confined to national borders.
No,
It's a global problem, and there's a whole international framework in place aimed at addressing it.
exactly. And India, being a signatory to many international conventions and agreements, is actively involved in this global effort.
Okay, so what are some of the key international instruments that are relevant to this topic? I'm guessing there are quite a few.
There are. One of the most fundamental is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted by the United Nations in 1948. It sets out a comprehensive set of fundamental rights and freedoms, including the right to be free from slavery and forced labor.
Ah, yes, the UDHR. It's like a global charter for human dignity. It's been incredibly influential, inspiring constitutions and laws all over the world.
Absolutely. And then you have conventions that are more specific to the issue of exploitation. One that's particularly relevant is the International Labor Organization's Forced Labor Convention of 1930.
Okay.
It defines forced labor and outlines the obligations of countries to eliminate it.
So it's like a more detailed rule book, zooming in on this particular form of exploitation.
Precisely. And India ratified this convention back in 1954, demonstrating its commitment to tackling forced labor.
What about conventions that deal with other forms of exploitation, like child labor?
There are several. The ILO's Minimum Age Convention of 1973 aims to eliminate child labor by setting a minimum age for employment, while the Worst Forms of Child Labor Convention of 1999 focuses on eradicating the most harmful and exploitative forms of child labor.
So things like slavery, child trafficking, and hazardous work.
Exactly. And India has ratified both of these conventions as well.
It sounds like India is really trying to align its laws and practices with international standards, not just going it alone.
That's right. And it's not just about signing on the dotted line. It's about actively participating in international efforts to combat exploitation, collaborating with other countries, sharing information, and working together to develop solutions.
because this is a global problem, it demands a global response.
Hmm.
And it's not just about governments, right?
Yeah.
There are international NGOs and advocacy groups playing a vital role too.
Absolutely. Organizations like Anti-Slavery International, Free the Slaves, and the Global March Against Child Labor are doing incredible work to raise awareness, conduct research, and push for change.
It's like a global movement for human rights, a collective effort to create a world where exploitation is no longer tolerated.
It is. And it's a movement that's gaining momentum.
But, uh, but let's be realistic. There are still huge challenges, aren't there?
Oh, absolutely. Exploitation is deeply entrenched, often driven by poverty, inequality, and a lack of opportunity. Enforcing international conventions can be incredibly difficult, especially when it comes to issues like bonded labor or child labor that often happen in the shadows.
Right, those informal settings where it's harder to monitor and regulate.
Yeah,
And then there are issues like corruption, weak law enforcement, and sometimes a lack of political will.
exactly. It's a complex web of factors that contribute to the persistence of exploitation.
But despite these challenges, it's important to acknowledge that progress is being made.
Yes.
There's more awareness, stronger legal frameworks, and increased collaboration than ever before.
And that's reason for hope.
It is.
Yeah.
Because ultimately, this is about upholding the inherent dignity of every human being, recognizing that everyone deserves to be treated with respect and fairness, regardless of their circumstances.
Well said. And that's a fight worth fighting.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the Right Against Exploitation in India, I think it's important to emphasize that this is an ongoing journey. There's always more to learn, more to do, and more ways to contribute to this fight.
I couldn't agree more. It's a continuous process of understanding the complexities, supporting those working on the ground, and holding ourselves and others accountable.
Because in the end, creating a world free from exploitation requires a collective effort.
It does. And it's an effort that each and every one of us can be a part of.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it's been insightful and thought-provoking.
And that it's inspired you to continue exploring this crucial aspect of human rights.
Thank you for listening to LexTalks. Follow, subscribe, and stay notified for future episodes.